sort of added another affiliation to your collection since we spoke
Right.
last. You
You know,
want to tell us a little bit about that?
throughout my career, I've been collecting all the top-level domains. Mostly been going back and forth between .edu and .com, although I spent a little bit of time at .gov at NASA, and I've been involved with a couple of .orgs. But right, I'm this year I'm spending most of my time at the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute. I still have my Google badge because you got to eat a good lunch every now and then. And use the espresso machines there.
You can come to Facebook if you want to for that.
Okay, yeah, that's good. And I'm interested in looking again at education. So a decade ago, Sebastian Thrun and I said, this seems like a good time to try to bring what we know to students who aren't in the classroom with us. And we did an online class, and we got 20-something thousand students all the way through it, and 100,000 to at least see a little bit of it. And we thought that we'd be able to do a bunch of machine learning and data science and learn a lot from that. And so Sebastian and I were machine learning people. Daphne Kohler and Andrew Ng, who started Coursera, they were also machine learning people, and we all thought that this was going to happen. It didn't go as fast or as well as we'd liked, but now I think is a good time to try again. So one thing that's different is, back then we had access to tens of thousands of students, and now there's tens of millions across various platforms, and some of that data is publicly available. One of the largest competitions on Kaggle was for educational data. And then in some cases, the data is much more fine-grained, that the browsers are instrumented. So, the teacher can see, here's where this student was spending their time on sort of a second-by-second basis, and learn more about their students that way. And then another factor is that, unfortunately for the world, a lot of us have spent the last year and a half or so behind a screen, and so everyone's gotten more used to that. And so that makes it easier to do data analysis for that. And then another thing that's really interesting, and I hope we can talk some more about this throughout this conversation, is that these large language models now really have the capability to hold conversations. And 10 years ago, we could have a little search box, or we could have a chat box of some kind, and it was very limited in what it can do. And now the language models can certainly do more. They're not quite at a trustworthy point, so we'll get back to that. But it's a tantalizing technology to take a look at. And then I think finally, another thing that's interesting is we have a little bit more experience understanding what it's like to author a collaborative, comprehensive, open source corpus of information, right? So if we want to teach the world, where is that information going to come from? And I think, at least I understand a little bit better what the models are like, so in what sense did Wikipedia succeed, and in what sense did it have problems, and what are the right ways to put together a group of people to author stuff like that? So it just seemed like an interesting time to look at that more seriously. And for me, I thought it made more sense to do that with a .edu at the end of my name. So what have you been up to?
Hold it, I'm not letting you off the hook quite yet.
Okay.
Education.
All right.
So you mentioned two technology advances, language models, and the fact that we know how to do Wikipedia. Has anything else changed in technology that would make online education different than it was 10 years ago?
So I mentioned just sort of the familiarity that more people have with it. And so I guess that, in some sense, that makes things a little bit more equitable. That, we were certainly worried that we felt like, we can reach a lot more people than just people who were admitted to Stanford. So that was good. But we also knew that we were limited to people that have access to computer access and so on. And we knew that that was leaving a lot of people out. And I think as time goes on and as computing hardware gets cheaper, as cell phones become more ubiquitous, more people become included in that. So I think that's a difference.
What about getting more of the people who start the course to go all the way through? What do you think are the bottlenecks there?
Yeah, so that was, especially in the early days, that was the biggest criticism of these MOOCs. One of the things we did at the courses we ran at Google is we ran a bunch of courses there. We had things like Dan Russell teaching how to search with Google more effectively and so on. Is at the beginning of the class, we asked people, what are your goals? What are you here for? And we found that, 90% of the people did drop out of the class. But of those people that dropped out, most of them at the beginning said, hey, I'm going to drop out. I have no intention of completing this class. I'm just here to sample. It's not like I'm buying the book in the bookstore. It's like I'm browsing the shelves in the bookstore and I want to flip through this book and then I'm going to put it back on the shelf. So we found, we still only had a 10% completion rate, but we had like an 80% satisfaction rate of people achieve what they wanted to achieve. And I know I'm certainly bringing those statistics way down because I probably started 100 classes and not finished them.
What if somebody told you, I'm really interested in this AI thing you're doing, but I want a 3-hour lecture that'll get me, somewhere better than where I am right now. Can you imagine that? Or somebody else might want 10 hours. Can you imagine a system that sort of tailors the length and the depth of the material to the needs of the student?
Yeah, so I think that's really important in multiple ways, right? So we want it to be adaptive, to meet the student's goals of how deep do you want to go, to meet the student's background of what do you already know, so we don't have to explain it, and what do you not know, so that we don't confuse you, or we can point you out to, here's some background material you should learn first. And sort of understanding what their goals are and what their current state is, that's important. I think coming back, and so some of these systems are sort of capturing students long term, like they're used in the classroom for K-12 students and so on. And there you want to look at things like spaced repetition to say, we taught you this, but do you still remember it? So let's have a refresher and so on. And that's got to be personalized to their schedule. So I think that's really important. I think it's, I've seen that this has been a big area of frustration, particularly when it comes to younger students because of the laws around that, right? So if you're under 13, you need permission to keep records on them. And it's really hard to get that permission from the parents. So then you end up not being able to personalize for these people that you really wanted to personalize. So yeah, if you're using the software in the classroom, and you're going to be using it all year round, then you get the parents to sign off, and then that's great. But a lot of these systems, they're used just by somebody saying, teacher in class said something confusing, I want to find out more about it. I do a search, I land on this site, and now it's asking me for permission. That's too complicated. So I wish there was some better way to satisfy all these privacy type constraints, which are really important, but also to be able to move forward and help those students. And so I think that's going to be a continuing battle.
Indeed. So, I started the year working for a company called Facebook. And then one day over lunch, I realized—
But now you work for a company called Meta, right?
Yes. And so as part of that transition, I have to ask you the next question, which is, how is education going to change in the metaverse? And by what I mean by that is, we can go in two directions. One, probably more interesting one, is if I have a VR set on my head, can I just make a learning experience much more immersive and interesting? And maybe it's not for machine learning, maybe it's for the history, history.
Sure.
AR, the glasses that we're gonna, in a few years from now wear, and everywhere we go, you're learning everywhere, right? You're every time you travel, you walk down the street, you can learn something. Maybe there's education on the go. What are your views on that?
I guess my main view is you're asking the wrong guy. So, I don't play video games. I've put those devices onto my head, various prototype devices at various times, and it just doesn't click with me. It's not exciting to me. But I know for millions of people, it is really cool, and they spend a lot of time playing these 3D immersive games and so on, and that's really important to them. So, you should ask them. But I guess to me, yeah, you're learning about ancient Rome, and it would be great to be able to walk through the Agora and see all the sights and so on, and be able to turn your head in any direction and see what you want to see. So I can understand that would be great. That would be a great experience. It's better than looking at a static picture or reading a piece of text. So I agree with that. I guess one thing I would really like to see is, can it be used for better sort of personal interaction, right? Because one thing that I felt I really learned in doing this online classes is I came in thinking the most important part was information. If I correctly and concisely say what I know, then my job is done. And I realized that what was much more important was motivation, to get the students excited. And to do that, you really want to make a personal connection. And so if AR or VR can do that to make you feel more like you're in the room with someone and you're working together and you have teammates and you rely on them and they rely on you, I think that's really crucial. And maybe just that sort of being closer to reality would really help that feeling of camaraderie and getting people to work hard for each other. So that I can see. I have, I've been to like conferences in Second Life, and I felt that wasn't good enough. At least for me, I didn't feel like I was in a real physical space, and that made me feel like that was good. I just felt like, oh, it's confusing, and how do I move from one place to another? And that didn't work for me. But that was primitive compared to what we have now. So maybe this new technology will achieve that.
I'll ask you one more question about education, then I'll let you off the hook. Given that we're supposed to talk about deep learning, Bindu will remind us of that in a moment. So in everything we've talked so far, personalizing, your education or your course offering, do you think deep learning can actually offer a step function to achieve our goals?
Yeah. So right, and I think we both noted that it was a little bit odd to put us in a session that was titled Deep Learning when we're more observers of the technology rather.
My fault. I should have said AI and or machine learning. Sorry.
But so we're coming at it from we haven't authored any key papers or made any key innovations in the field. But I think we're both really interested in it, and we have perspective for how the field has evolved. And there's certainly lots of stuff going on. I think, to me, the key point is that deep learning, to a large extent, frees us from dealing with highly constrained symbols that we were dealing with in earlier parts of symbolic AI. Right, so we used to have expert systems. You wrote out rules and say if X and Y and Z, then do this, and that made a lot of sense if the concepts you're dealing with were mathematically well-defined concepts, like we know what a triangle is and so on. But if they are human-defined concepts like justice and freedom, we don't know exactly what the bounds on that are. And so it didn't make sense to try to define them in terms of strictly defined symbols. So deep learning gets away from that. It sacrifices some of the ability to do chaining of if A, then B, then C, then D. And we have to learn how to harness it, right? And so to me, one of the things I've been focusing on is these language models and trying to figure out how to harness them. And as I said, I think they're very impressive. They can carry out coherent and relevant conversations. And they sound like they know what they're talking about, but they can also say things that just aren't true at all. And they don't know what they don't know, right? So you can ask them, how many legs does a horse have? And they say 4. You say, wow, that's great. You say, how many legs does purple have? And they say 4. They don't say, what are you talking about, right? They don't know what they don't know. And I think of them as being kind of like the character of Chauncey Gardner in Being There, where they're well-dressed, they act like responsible, serious adults. And so we as interlocutors, we just project onto them, well, that they must really be that because they sound like that, but they aren't. And so we're vulnerable to kind of putting too much trust in them because they sometimes sound like they know what they're doing. And so we as engineers need to learn how to counter that. And I think computer engineers have learned how to build reliable computing systems out of unreliable parts. And so I was at Berkeley when RAID was developed, and sort of this idea of disks fail, but we can still make it so the overall computer system doesn't fail, even though the parts are unreliable. And so we need to know how to do that with AI models. That we have these components and they have some cool capabilities, but we know they're going to make mistakes. Can we then contain those mistakes and build other parts on top of them to make them more reliable? So I think that's really important.
But one question about language models is they seem to be used for more than they were designed for. And one example of that, I mean, there's some very nice work on trying to find what a language model knows. For example, does it know the capitals of all countries in the world? I mean, it's great that you're able to read the web and get knowledge, and what could possibly go wrong when you do that, right? But we have a spreadsheet with 200 and something rows that tells us exactly what are the capitals of the world, and if something changes, we can go into that spreadsheet and change it, and we have our knowledge up to date. Or if we're talking about what is the stock price of Apple today, there's no way the language model will know that. So how do we? It seems like we should be able to get language models to sort of understand language, and when they're actually being asked a question, to go to the right source to answer it, rather than trying to hallucinate stuff from the model itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to me, all this exploration has unveiled what an amazing technology we have. But the amazing technology is not deep nets. The amazing technology is human language, right? I mean, this is pretty incredible that we invented this system where you can just put down scratches on a piece of paper or on a magnetic disk and convey so much. And so just reading the web does so much. But I think, as you say, not everything is in the form of text. And that's something we've really focused on. But we're missing out a lot when we say, all our knowledge is going to come from reading text. A lot of knowledge is there, and probably as a society, we've focused on writing it that way. But as you say, a lot of it is in tables. A lot of it is in programs that you have to look up. So look up the stock price by doing a search or interfacing with a system or so on. A lot of information is in photos and videos, and we're starting to be able to extract information from photos. I think we need another generation of computing before we can really process all the world's videos and make sense of all that. But right, we need to make sense of all of those, and there has been some work in these multimodal systems that fuse all this type of information. I think they probably haven't done as good a job as being able to read tables and make sense of them. And so, you know, I'd like your take on how we're going to be able to do that.
Well, so I mean, you hit on the multimodal issue, which I think is key, right? I mean, so one of the team I'm part of in Facebook AI is integrity, where we try to develop AI models that will recognize hate speech or misinformation or bullying speech and stuff like that. And you know, memes, when you actually take an image and put a text on it, are a very common form of hate speech. So, for example, you can say, I'll take a benign example. Okay, I love you write the text. I love the way you smell today. Okay, but then you overlay that on an image of a skunk. That doesn't sound like that's not something that you that necessarily sounds good. But the skunk itself looks fine, and the I love the way you smell today looks fine. It's that connection between them. Or the more extreme example is when you say all your people belong here, and you overlay that over a picture of a cemetery. Okay, and so now the question in my so fusing those multi-modalities is important. But then there's also something else going on here, right? When you're putting the I love the way you smell today over a picture of a skunk, there's also additional information that says that skunks don't actually smell very good, right? And that's going on. It's not in the image, it's not in the text, but it's somewhere else. And as humans, we're able to connect it. You know, it's in Wikipedia. And so how do we make sure we get those what we call common sense knowledge also into these models? That seems like a fascinating challenge that I know a lot of people are working on.
So it seems like you've really highlighted two challenges, right? So there's a technical challenge of how do you understand what's going on here? And then there's an ethical challenge of what's acceptable speech and what's hate speech that's not acceptable, or what's correct and what's incorrect. And how do you deal with that?
Now you're you're raising the stakes here, Peter. So I think that's an excellent point, right? So what might be considered hate speech, say here in the U.S., might be considered just usual conversation in Israel, right, where we tend to be a little more honest with each other, and so there are so the way the way social networks deal with this is there's a set of policies. Okay, now these policies are they might say, if you talk about a protected population like Asians or Black people or Jews or women or men, and then you have to have some sort of attack vector. You might be dehumanizing them or whatever. There are a bunch of ways of defined ways of having this attack vector. So now you can say, if you do any of those things, then that is considered hate speech. But that is the social network deciding what that is. And to a certain extent, the social network has the right to do that because it's still the platform. And you want to do hate speech, go to a different platform. We don't want to do it here. That's not the product we're offering you, right? But but if you go too far with that, then you start imposing your human values on other people, and there is a tension there of where you don't want to be too paternal. You want to let people connect. That's why the social network is there for, and that's a tricky balance to strike. And obviously that's been in the news a lot as well over the last.
So we have these issues of large corporations having a big sway on the public and having to make their choices of what products they're going to offer and what rules you're going to have to operate under. And we're also seeing governments crack down more. and imposing their own rules.
Yep.
And the internet was built originally to be open and international. Is that going to survive, or are we going to see each country have their own version?
That's a great question. I think it will survive, and I think governments. I'm not an expert on policy and certainly not law, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But governments are trying to write policies that are good for their people, but also protect them against harms and try to make sure that society goes in a way that the local culture believes. And so, for example, there's an interesting recent post by Pascal Fong from Hong Kong about the difference between how the European Union talks about regulating AI and how the Chinese government talks about regulating AI. And I'm not an expert on this still, but the way it goes is it really is based in the cultural underpinnings of these two places, okay, which can vary. In Europe it can vary from one government, from one election to another, but there's still an ethos in Europe that is different, not better or worse than what it is in China, and that gets reflected in the way governments talk about regulating AI. I think the issue there is when you regulate AI, you need to write regulations that are actually implementable, right? So if you're going to say, well, show us your model, well, you don't want to see my trillion parameter model, because you're not going to get much out of it, right? A simpler example is, and this came up in some policy discussions, some governments want to enforce social networks to have a chronological option, right? So you can say, I don't want AI in determining what is the, how my feed will look like. Just show me whatever my friends posted in the order that they posted it, and that's what I'm going to get. Fine. But now what if one of your friends posted 50 things in a row? Do you really want to see that? Or can I collapse that into, Peter has just had a lot to say, and if you want to expand here, and you can see everything that Peter said.
Yeah, and I think you and I, as being engineers in companies that are doing these kinds of things, when you hear that, you immediately think of all sorts of attack vectors of, people making fake accounts to become your friends. So now it's much easier to spam your feed with what they want.
Exactly. Exactly.
That seems like a nightmare to me, to not be able to have some defenses against those types of attacks.
Exactly. And so now the question is, what is an algorithm and what is an AI algorithm, right? And we don't want to start defining that, right? Because we know that's not going to go anywhere. But so how do you define a feed that is, quote, chronological with simple UI tricks to make it a little better and maybe protect you from harm, versus a completely AI determined feed that supposedly is trying to make you to give you the content that you want to see. And the thing is, the regulators don't know enough about computer science or AI to be able to write regulations that are implementable. And I think this is one of the challenges that we're going to be facing. Hopefully, joint dialogue with people where we educate back and forth. But that's what makes this fascinating. I think for you and me, right? We've been around for a while, right? Now it's really, we're seeing technology hitting society in such a really interesting way. And obviously, it's not a smooth ride. It's never going to be a smooth ride.
Now, I understand you have a perspective on this related to the history of coffee.
Yes, I do. In fact, I published it yesterday on medium.com. So if you look at when coffee started coming, it came from Ethiopia through the Arabic peninsulas, but basically it met many people for the first time in the Ottoman Empire and in Cairo and Istanbul, and after that it moved into Europe. Now, the history of coffee is very similar to the history of social media. In the beginning, because what did coffee do? Okay, you come to a continent where the water is not potable. So what does that mean? It means people are drinking beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That doesn't lead to a very intellectual set of conversations. And furthermore, the information is being controlled by the kings, the governments, the religious establishments, or whatever the thing there is. So that's the background. All of a sudden, this drink comes, and people start opening coffee houses all over the continent, and people start coming to these coffee houses. First of all, they're alert because they're drinking this coffee thing, which is actually causing them to have more intellectual discussions. And second, they're connecting with people. They're starting to share information. That's information that not every local ruler wants to be shared, certainly not amplified. A lot of that information is true, correct information, but I'm sure there was a lot of misinformation, which spread even faster. And so the bottom line was, you see a history of rulers in the Ottoman Empire in all over Europe trying to crush coffee, trying to outrule it, trying to find medical arguments for why it should not be consumed. And we know what the result is. The result is, well, we're all drinking coffee, even though some of us have to settle for decaf. Coffee is contributing to our human values, creating jobs all over the world, and mostly connecting between people, which is one of the most important things we do. So social media is the same thing, right? It's bringing 99% good, or that's not an official number, okay? But it's bringing a lot of good, but it's also bringing some possible negative consequences, and we need to work these things out, just the way societies work these things out usually, and hopefully for the better. So that's my perspective. We've been here before, just our ancestors.
Should we open it up for
Yes,
Q&A? Or
sure.
is somebody going to moderate that, or how's that going to work?
Let's see. Do we have the should be on the chat, right? Let's see.
Okay, so there's a Q&A section, a Q&A window, as well as chat. So anyone who has any questions, please please post them on chat or on the Q&A section. Here's one. From a responsible technologist standpoint, what are your thoughts on the dynamics between free speech? I guess you probably addressed this, between free speech, hate speech, and political correctness.
Yeah, this is something we deal with all the time.
Yeah, so, and I think the interesting thing there is that this is not really a question for technologists to answer. This is a question for society to answer, and then technologists to carry that out.
Here's another one. If ever do
I want to, can I just add to that?
Oh yeah, please.
I think it's important to highlight the difference between hate speech and misinformation. So hate speech, you can write a policy and you can argue with that policy and refine that policy over time. And then what we do is we develop classifiers that try to predict whether something violates the policy. Misinformation is different because misinformation is about whether something is true in the world. And you certainly don't want any social network determining what is true in the world and what isn't, okay? Or they're developing classifiers for figuring that out. So what happens with misinformation is that suspected misinformation actually gets farmed out to what's called third-party fact checkers that actually come from different domains like medical or political and from different parts of the political spectrum. And they're the ones that determine whether something is misinformation or not. Now that's tricky because the number of people, the number of third-party fact checkers is very small. And by the time they fact check, you could argue that some of the damage has already been done. But it's an important distinction to keep in mind.
Okay. And here's one I want to respond to in the chat. It says, Peter, would you want to update or change the definition of AI from your textbook? So, we started in '95 and for the first edition, and we got the fourth edition out last year. And I think we have evolved in how we think about AI. I think for the first three editions, we said we're going to define AI as maximizing expected utility in tasks for which humans would need intelligence. And then we said, and here's all these cool algorithms for how we're going to do that. And then I think over time, one thing that happened is the emphasis shifted from the algorithms to the data. And you still need to have the algorithms, and they're still in our book because they got to be somewhere. But to the day-to-day practitioner, it was less about having to study all the algorithms because you're just going to download them from GitHub anyways. And it was more about, did you have the right data to deal with them? And then I think in the last few years, that changed again. And now the algorithms and data are still important. But what's become more pressing is what is the objective function that you're trying to optimize? And in the early days, we just said, oh, well, that's given. That's outside the problem. Your problem is just to optimize whatever you were told to optimize. And now we're saying, well, we got lots of cool algorithms. We got lots of data. Maybe the hardest part of all is figuring out what the right optimization function is and what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And we don't really have a good tool set for doing that. We're just sort of given, here's what you're trying to do. And if it's something like playing chess, that's fine. We know it's better to win than to lose. But if it's having a criminal justice system that's fair, it's a lot harder to describe what that means. And I think for AI to advance, we're going to need better ways to communicate what we mean by an objective function, and for society to agree on what the right thing is that we're trying to optimize.
I totally agree. I want to add to that. When we optimize, we often think about optimizing for a particular user who's using our system. But if we only optimize for users, we're going to lose the focus on societies, right? So going back to the previous question, if everybody gets to free speech and we optimize for that, then society as a whole is going to suffer, right? And so how do we balance our objectives between societal and individual? And that's that problem only goes back a few thousand years, right? We should be able to figure it out by now, but it's a really tough dilemma. Do you want to? So might you be writing a book about data?
Yeah. So that was talking about the AI textbook, and there's another book I'm working on, and we hope to ship it to the publisher this month. It's called Data Science in Context, and the co-authors are Alfred Spector and Jeanette Wing and Chris Wiggins, who's the chief data scientist for the New York Times. And it's a textbook. It's with Cambridge University Press, but doesn't have any equations in it. So it's more at this sort of social type level, or sort of explaining things for managers rather than getting into the details of all the algorithms. And so it talks a lot about these ethical, legal, and societal issues, and tries to put that all in context.
Can't wait to read it.
But I know you've looked at a draft. So
that's all I was giving.
All right,
Here's a good one.
We'll send you the rest.
Question for Peter Norvig and Alon Halavi. Yeah. When, if ever, do you think there will be AI with human-level general intelligence?
Yeah, I don't know. And I guess, my take has been we got a ways to go. And I haven't been sort of following this AGI work because I still think it's too early. It's like, if after the Wright brothers, you had said, okay, now it's time for artificial general flight, and we want something that's a helicopter and can fly to the moon and can be a jet that carries 400 passengers, that would not have been the right time to start working on that. Instead, it would be, well, we need some theory of aeronautics and understand that better, and we need some components. Let's build better engines, and then let's build jet engines, and let's build better materials, and have carbon fiber skins, and so on and so on. And so I think we're still at that stage of saying we don't have all the technologies yet. And we get excited, and deep learning is a cool technology, but I think we need a dozen other components first before we're at that stage where we can say, now we can assemble something that's really going to get there. But I guess my other take is like I said earlier, we as humans really want to meet more than halfway. And so I think before we have something that the experts will say this really meets human level intelligence, I think a lot of the general public will accept it for being really useful, and they'll relate to it as if it were a real living thing. And we do that all the time, right? So my daughter had a teddy bear, and she thought of that as if it was a real live thing, and it did not have very convincing behaviors at all. It just kind of sat there, and yet we still want to love the things we interact with, and we still want to project onto them great abilities. So I think that's going to happen in AI long before we really get to where we want to be.
Perfect.
I agree with that. General artificial intelligence was one of the reasons, not the only one, that got me into the field. But I still would settle for something that actually automatically creates a to-do list for me for every day, and throughout the day gives me the best advice about what I should be doing right now in order to satisfy the things I need to do and the things I want to do and the things that are good for me to do. I'd be happy, and that's going to take a few more years, and
Yeah.
that seems like a doable goal, but it's not AGI.
Yeah, I think so, and I think as a field, we haven't done a good job with that. And I always go back to Mick Jagger, and I think he got it exactly backwards. He said you can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. And actually, we built this global marketplace that's the opposite of that. It feeds you exactly what you say you want, right? So it gives you all these memes and so on, and you said you wanted them because you clicked on them. And when you clicked on them, you get more. And it's worse than that. When you click on them, everybody else gets more, because we're doing collaborative filtering. But there's nowhere to click on what you need. Right? You rarely see the let's end poverty or have global peace and click on this, and now everybody will get more of that. We haven't built a system that gives us what we really need. We've built one based on sort of commercial interests that gives us what we want in the short term. And so if we can solve that problem, now we're a lot closer to solving your to-do list and much more than that.
Sounds like from the chat that Richard Socher is working on it. So
excellent.
Yes.
Right.
So thank you.
Richard's the real person you should have had as the deep learning expert.
He is here. He's going to be the next person. My apologies. I should have said the future, present, and the past of AI.
No problem. We're having a fun time talking.
I know.
What the topic is.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.